Hey T-Heads, this is Don from Mayleaf, and in this video I want to give you a much requested overview of the different types of Yixing Zisha clays out there. You may have heard about clay teaware and you have probably heard the term Yixing clay, but from there it can get a bit confusing. So I wanted to give you the essential overview from which you can obviously dive deeper. I'm not going to be talking about the actual effects of the different clays on brewing and their suitabilities for different teas. I've made a load of those videos already, and you can see links to those videos in the description below. I'm also not going to be covering the different quality grades of clay and processing methods, the distinct detailed processing methods, because they vary wildly and will be here all day. Instead, this video is here to give you a clearer picture of all of the different categories of Zisha clay so that you can navigate the fascinating waters of clay teaware with a little bit more confidence. Before we get into it, let me also say that this is a vast area, and much like everything in tea, the deeper you go, the more complicated things get, with many differing opinions. So this will be a general overview of my approach to clay. Feel free to disagree, of course, in the comments so that we can engage the discussion. I also want to give a huge thanks to teatechnique.org, the website. I'll put a link in the description below, and Jason Cohen, who is in the process of writing an incredibly detailed book about Yixing Zisha, and that has informed a lot of this video. So let's start with a little chart of clays, which you can follow as we go down the chart. The clays will become more specific. At the top, we can put the heading of famous Chinese clays. The 5 main clays that are well known in China are Yixing Zisha, Chaozhou Zhuni, Jianshui Zitao, Nixing Qinzhou, and Chongqing Rongchang. All of them will have further subcategories depending on the ores. You can hear that word a lot, the ores used to make up the clays. But overall, 4 out of these 5 famous clays are relatively more simple. There are not a lot of different types of Nixing clay, Chaozhou Zhuni, Jianshui Zitao, or Chongqing Rongchang. Obviously there are, and there's details in there, but not as much as Zisha. So usually you'll just hear that a pot is made from Nixing clay or Jianshui or Chaozhou clay without any further subcategorization. Chongqing Rongchang, not easy to say, is mostly used for food storage vessels. And while some teaware is made from this clay, it's not as popular as the other clay types. Zisha, Yixing Zisha, however, has many different subcategorizations. In fact, the term Zisha does not refer to a particular clay, but is an umbrella term to describe a group of clays. Zisha can be translated as purple sand and refers more to the unrefined ores in the mountain. Therefore, Zisha actually refers to any clay made from these ores. The term is often confused with Zini, which translates to purple clay, which is just one type of Zisha clay. And we'll talk about the different types of Zisha clay a bit later on. Before we get into them, you should know that Yixing is just the area where the famous Zisha clays are produced. And you can make similar clays from similar ores mined from other places. This is especially prevalent as the quantity of clay available from Yixing is diminishing, whilst its popularity is increasing. Now, I'm not in a position to judge the clays from other areas because we only buy currently Yixing clay for our Zisha teaware, but they will no doubt have different compositions and different effects on the tea. As an overall guide, at present, I would recommend trying to find Zisha clays from Yixing because it's just, you're going to have more standardization in that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a lot better. But I would look for Yixing explicitly stated by the teapot seller. Right, so let's dive in to Yixing Zisha. Before we start talking about the clay types, it is worth getting a little background about what defines a clay type. When we refer to clay in teaware, we're actually referring to the material that comes from processing of ores which have been mined from the mountain. This is not the same as like layers of clay which you just naturally find in the soil. The clay is made from processing ores. Yixing has supplied the raw ores to make clay for over 2,000 years. Its location, importantly, is next to an old aquatic basin. It's next to Lake Taihu and near the end of the world's third longest river, the Yangtze River, which means it has been fed many different varieties of minerals and ores from all over China and from the sea. It has an incredibly diverse array of ores, which can be used to make a variety of clays. An ore is basically a rock or sediment which contains valuable minerals and metals, and it is then blended and processed into clay used by the potters. This processing technique will vary depending on the ores, but essentially involves drying and grinding the ores into fine powders and then mixing them with water. But as you'll see, it's a lot more complicated than that. And then eventually you make your clay. From there, the clay can be further blended and worked or aged to change their properties. These properties will then change further depending on how the clay is fired, but that's the discussion of a whole other video. So the different Zisha clays are predominantly defined by the types of ore being used to make those clays. Ores can be grouped by their color and texture, but also by the mountain that they come from and the actual mine that they were located from. They will differ in terms of the type, ratio, structure of the minerals that they contain, and these differences will have a huge effect on the properties of the clay when brewing up tea. Overall, Yixing ores all contain quartz, kaolin, and feldspar, which give the resulting teaware its structure and hardness. One of the key variations between the ores is the type of minerals, especially like iron oxide in the ores. Their concentration and how they react to the different styles of firing changes the ceramics. In addition to the natural compounds in the ores, there are some traditional additives which may be used, such as adding extra iron oxide in order to increase the vibrancy of the color, or clay or chromium to increase the greenness or paleness of like luni clay. This is not harmful for health and is a traditional technique to add additives. Obviously, be wary of any additives which are harmful, like paints, which are sometimes used in the production of very cheap so-called Yixing Zisha teaware. Right, let's talk about the mines in Yixing. And again, I'm going to barely scratch the surface, but you'll often hear about mines. The most famous mine in Yixing is called Huanglongshan. This is sometimes called the original mountain. And so clay from it can sometimes be called Benshan clay. Benshan translates as original mountain. There are other historical Ming Dynasty mines as well, such as the Jiaozhuang, Hongwei, and Qinglongshan mines. So there are 4 historical mines, and confusingly, sometimes the term Benshan is used to denote any clay which is made from ores which come from these old mines. And so the term Benshan is an unreliable indicator. It doesn't really tell you that much apart from it that the clay should be made from ores mined from those historical mines. But who knows? There's no control over these things. Apart from these historical mines, there are a few other modern day mines in Yixing which are abundant in excellent ores for Yixing ceramics. So you can look out for those. They'll be cheaper as well. The mines vary in style from open pits, which are excavated layer by layer, to shaft mines, which involves tunneling through the mountainside to access specific layers of ores. Each shaft is numbered, so you can get very specific information about the location of the ore used to make the clay used to make your teapot. For example, the number 4 shaft of Huanglongshan, number 4 mine, is famed for producing top quality ore, and you'll often see that being written by sellers. Once the ores have been mined, they need to be converted into clay, and this requires skill, experience, and often secret techniques used by artisans. From a simple point of view, the ores are dried, weathered, crushed, blended, and mixed with water before being aged to improve the clay's moldability. But this transformation from ores to working clay is a highly technical process which will radically change the performance of the teaware and is more important than any other process into determining the performance of the clay, much more important than the potter, the construction, or the firing. A high quality clay will go through the following process, again, simplified. First, the ores are sorted. Any mixed ores are reserved for more affordable clays. The ores which are purely of one subtype are more desirable because this allows for more precise blending when you're creating blends for your clay. And therefore you can determine with more accuracy the properties of the clay by the clay maker. The ores are importantly then weathered. This means that they're exposed to the elements after being mined, so the organic material in these ores breaks down and impurities are removed. This greatly affects the quality of the clay, its reaction to how it's fired, and its plasticity when molding and creating the teaware. The ores will often be exposed to sun and to water. I don't know much about the weathering process, but it's a long process. It can take months to years depending on the level of detail applied to this process, and eventually they get broken down into smaller pieces as they weather. Longer weathered ores are always considered to be higher quality, apparently with the exception of Zhuni, which we'll talk about the different subtypes later. After weathering the clay, weathering the ores, I should say, the ores are crushed into a powder. The fineness of the powder and how much it's crushed will change the resulting clay's properties. Very small particles will make an easier to work clay, but larger particle size will improve the strength, porosity, and grainy texture of the teapots. And there's often this interplay between how easy it is to work with, but then the quality of the clayware starts to suffer a little bit. That's a generalization, but you'll often hear that in exploring and understanding Yixing teaware. Now, industrially milled ores, so milled by machines, are generally less desirable because they make very fine powder, too fine, and the ores are therefore produce clays which are easy to work but less high quality, less porous, whereas the ores milled by hand provide variability in the particle size, which are then sieved to separate the different sizes, and then they're blended again with accuracy by the Yixing artisans to get the right level of workability and porosity. They produce coarser clays when they're milled by hand, but usually better performance. The powdered ores are then blended and mixed with water to make a slurry. And then they're stored for a few weeks covered in clean water to allow the ores to hydrate fully and start to stick together. Sometimes the clay is then stirred in these tanks to improve water absorption and changes the density of the clay. So all these fine little things that can be done to change the property of the clay. Once the clay has set, the covering water is drained away and the clay is worked into slabs to remove excess water and air and make a consistent material. This is traditionally achieved by beating the clay with mallets, whereas modern techniques use machines to stretch, squeeze the clay. The machine set clay is, again, usually more dense and will not have as much of the desirable porosity and texture of higher quality Zisha, which will have more of an effect on the tea if it's more porous and is beaten by hand or produced with less industrialization. The last step in clay production is the aging process, which allows any remaining organic material to decompose and improves the plasticity and coherence of the clay. Aged clay is less likely to break during firing too, so there's an added guarantee if you're using aged clay that you're gonna have less wastage. The average aging time of modern clay is around up to 6 months, but traditionally clay would be aged from 1 to 3 years, and you can get clay which is aged for much longer than that. All right, I've just given you a very simplistic outline of the process to turn ores into clay. There are so many more details, and you can see how this processing stage will radically change the properties and quality of your teaware. A poorly processed clay will never make a good pot, even in the hands of the most skilled Yixing artisan. And now is the time for that artisan to step in and select their clay. First, they must rework the clay and knead it to ensure the clay's consistency. They will often add additions like quartz, Zisha powder, or even remilled fired clay. So they fire some clay and then they mill down that fired clay and start to add it to their clay to alter the texture, appearance, and strength of their clay. Once they're happy with their blend, they can then begin crafting their teaware. All right, let's get on to the most often asked question that we get about Zisha clay. What are the different types? I have in front of me Zisha here, and these are the other three of the other 4 famous clays. I don't have the Rongchang clay because, as I said, it's not often used to make teaware. We've got Chaozhou Zhuni, Chaozhou red clay. we've got Zhenshui Zitao, and we've got Yixing clay. So these are not Yixing Zisha. They're not Zisha clays. Yixing, Zhenshui, and Chaozhou. Beautiful clays, all have their own properties and need to be explored in their own right, but more simplistic, as I said. There's less sub-varieties. Obviously, everything in tea has complexity, so you can dive deep into Zhenshui Zitao, but overall, it's a little bit simpler to understand, and you don't see so much written about the different subcategories. Okay, here in front of me, however, I've got Zisha. I've got Yixing Zisha clays. So we're going to talk about the different types. And again, there's controversy about this, but I'm just going to go with what I have heard, and also check out that teatechnique.org book if you want to get a little bit more information about it, a lot deeper information about it. But there are arguably 5 different main subcategories of Zisha clay. They are Zini, Hongni, Zhuni, Duanni, and Duanni. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The type of the subcategory is primarily dependent and determined by the type of ores used in the production of the clay. And while we can make some generalizations about the properties of each clay type, it is crucially important to understand that the whole subject is epically complex. First of all, the quality, color, texture, composition, and overall properties of any ore will vary tremendously, even if it's the same ore type, depending on where it was mined and how it was weathered and how it was processed into the resulting clay. In this way, you can have many different Zini clays made from genuine Zini ores, but having very different appearances and qualities. Secondly, it is unusual for any teaware to be made purely from a singular Zisha ore. Almost all clay will be blended in some way. Zini a little bit less, tends to be a bit more pure in terms of its ores, but most of the other clays will be blended in some way. They'll be blended with other Zisha ores and other mined material to improve workability and performance. This blending is not something that should be scoffed at. In fact, this is a traditional way of making those antique pots. In fact, all of these antique pots that command such high prices, they are almost always blended pots. Apart from the Zisha ores, there are plenty of other valuable non-Zisha materials that are mined and added to the clays to change the color, workability, texture, porosity, and overall quality of the teaware. Materials such as Qingni, which is a blue clay, or Baini, which is a white clay, are mined at the same time as the ores and treated like an ingredient to add to the clay for blending. So you don't often get truly pure singular ore clay pots. There's oftentimes blending involved. Producers will create their own blends, which blur the strict lines of clay classification, will mean that the properties of 2 Zini pots made even from the same vein of Zini ores will vary depending on how they've been blended differently. Finally, even if you took exactly the same blended clay and handed it to 2 different potters, they would still have differences in the properties of their resulting teaware, because of the fact that the potters will be treating the clay differently. The potters will work the clay differently, and the style of firing will differ too. So to make claims that all Zini clay has similar effects on tea is a very big generalization. We can try to offer some pointers, of course, but ultimately each teapot should be assessed individually by the seller and then by yourself during your tea sessions. Right, let's look at the broad definitions of the 5 major tea types. Let's start here with Zini. You can see this is Zini. This is also Zini. Zini is by far the clay type which makes up the majority of Zisha teaware. It's often called purple clay because of the color, which is usually this sort of liver brown color. And as I said before, it's often confused with the term Zisha, which means purple sand. Zini ores are obviously used to make Zini clay, and they can be used without blending to produce clay that is pure Zini, because Zini actually by itself, the ores and the clay that is made by the pure ores already possesses a good plasticity and strength without any addition. So you're more likely to get pure Zini than any other of the clay types. Zini is one of the more porous Zisha clays out there, tends to have very obvious effects on the tea. There are 3 subcategories of Zini clay. Tian Qing Ni and Di Cao Qing are legendary clays made from very hard to find ores. The majority of Zini on the market is called Qing Shui Ni, which is an umbrella term, again another umbrella term, for any Zini clay not made from Tian Qing Ni and Di Cao Qing, so those harder to find ores. So then you've got all of these other ores under this umbrella term. There are lots of further classifications and categories of these clays depending on where the ores are mined, the position in the position of the ores in the layer in the mine, their appearance, but that's getting way too deep for this video. So that's Zini. Then you've got Hongni. This is the next major Zisha type, and again it refers to the color of the finished fired ceramic. Hongni means red clay. Now there's a lot of confusion and disagreement in how to categorize Hongni, because there are some Zini clays that appear red, and the famous Zhuni clay is also red. So do you put them all under red clay? A lot of people just throw any red colored teaware under Hongni, but others will specify the exact ore that makes Hongni to differentiate this clay from other red clay types. Hongni ore is apparently very specific and is formed from the weathering of white clay, which increases the amount of iron oxidase in the ores and other minerals. And that means that the ore, which is a sort of yellow color, fires to a red color after it's been put in the kiln. And that's mostly due to iron oxidase. Hongni is the second most commonly found ore after Zini ores. It usually produces teaware which is much more dense, hard and more brittle, with more subtle effects on the tea than Zini. If you ever hear the term Da Hong Pao Hongni clay, this is just a way of denoting high quality Hongni, and it really doesn't have any actual definition. Some people will only use that term to describe higher quality clays again, which come from Benshan, the original mines, but it's not a reliable term and is used very loosely. So I would not pay too much attention to Da Hong Pao Hongni. Next up, you've got Zhuni. Zhuni, or vermilion clay, is a distinct ore which is harder to find than Hongni ore. It fires to, again, a beautiful red color. Some people say, as I said, that it should be a subcategory of Hongni. Other people disagree. Historically, Hongni pots usually contained a blend of Hongni ores and Zhuni ores, just to confuse things even more. And many collectors use the term interchangeably, with the term Zhuni being used to describe very high colored, very vibrant, high quality Hongni. There is apparently a particular ore which makes true Zhuni, which is distinct from Hongni ores. These Zhuni ores are supposedly soft and powdery and are found in like egg-shaped deposits nestled in with other Zisha or clay layers. These Zhuni ores are made by weathering, just like Hongni, but the starting clay, which is then weathered into the ores, is different. It's apparently more tender and silky. Zhuni ores make up a very small percentage of mined ores from Yixing, estimated at less than 4% of the total Zisha ores found. And there are, once again, many different grades of Zhuni ores depending on how they were weathered and their mine location. Again, you might hear the term Da Hong Pao Zhuni, which is, again, used to denote top quality Zhuni, but there's no definition of what this actually means, so it's kind of a worthless description. The mineral content of Zhuni does apparently differ from Hongni, and it is a much harder clay to work with. It is sticky and shrinks a lot, which means that you get a lot of wastage during the firing of truly pure Zhuni pots. Finished Zhuni tends to be have a little bit more of a wrinkled appearance. It tends to be very dense with a very rich color. It is even less porous than Hongni and has quicker heat dissipation, so lower heat retention. It's therefore even more transparent in its effect on tea than Zini or Hongni. It is worth reminding ourselves that the term Zhuni is a debated term, and most Zhuni pots are actually a blend of Hongni and Zhuni ores. Finding a pot that is pure Zhuni is unusual, and this is not necessarily desirable from a tea drinking point of view because, as I said, pure Zhuni is very dense clay with very little effect on the tea. So the blend might actually work out more in your favor. It certainly has a more vibrant color, and this combined with its relative scarcity makes it a clay which is often sought after by collectors, but not necessarily because of its effect on the tea so much. So most Zhuni clay pots are sort of a blend of pure Zhuni ores with some Hongni, and that means that it's got more of a desirable effect on the tea than, I would say, pure Zhuni pots. Right, next up you have Luni. Luni is translated as green clay, which describes the color of the ore and the color of the clay used to make it before firing. But once Luni pots are fired, they will often look cream, beige, or yellow after firing. There are quite a few Luni ores with varying properties, but overall, Luni clay is very porous with high heat retention. The standard Luni ores make teaware which feels very smooth to the touch, more smooth than other clays. But the more sought after ores will often have more texture and variation in appearance. The quality and character of Luni ores once again depend on where the ores were mined and how they were processed, and you will often hear the term Benshan Luni to describe Luni mined from the original mountain from Huanglongshan. It can be very difficult to distinguish Luni from Duanni, which we'll talk about next. Both clays can make beige, cream, or yellow pots, but just like Hongni versus Zhuni, there are distinct ores which make up Luni, and so it is considered by many as a separate type of Zisha clay. The porous nature of Luni means that it can have strong effects of the tea compared to Zhuni and Hongni. Right, last up, Duanni. Duanni is kind of unique because it is different from other clays, because Duanni ores are actually made up of mixed deposits of other Zisha ores which have combined together naturally in the mountains and weathered together. In other words, Duanni could be a mix of Luni and Zini ores, which again, because they've blended together in the mountain and weathered together in the mountain, they've created a Duanni ore, a mixed up ore. Duanni is often found between layers of other ores. So the boundary between a layer of Luni and Hongni, you'll get this sort of blurred layer, which is mined as Duanni. Because Duanni is made up of a mix of other ores in varying quantities and with varying qualities, it represents a category of clay which will have immensely different colors, different textures, and different properties on your tea when you are brewing. Duanni can be smooth, like this, or they can be very rough, like this. They have varying degrees of workability and, produce pots of various qualities and effects. They can be white or brown or red, but mostly have some shade of yellow and beige in them. Local artisans will try to group Duanni by appearance. So you have gold Duanni, this one here, or you've got speckly clay Duanni, or yellow Duanni, or sesame Duanni if it's got lots of little black grains in it. It's therefore really not possible to describe the general characteristics of Duanni as a group in terms of how it affects your tea. But in my experience, yellow colored and pale Duanni tend to have the most effects on tea, on a tea, and overall they're more porous than red clay. So I would say these are the more porous ones compared to the red clay. How they compare to to Zini depends really on their blend, what the mix up of the ores are to make that Duanni. So there you have the 5 major categories of Zisha clay: Zini, Hongni, Zhuni, Duanni, and Duanni. There are plenty of other clay names which often come from blending various ores and non-Zisha material together, but these are not commonly found being sold or being marketed as teaware. But as I said, it's a very blurred field here. You've got blending happening all the time. When choosing your Yixing pot, you can now differentiate, I hope, between the basic terminology to describe the clay being used. You then have to decide on the shape and the style of the pot, which both have aesthetic and practical and functional considerations. You also need to decide if you would like to buy a fully handmade or a half handmade pot. Both are essentially handmade, but the half handmade ones are produced using shape guides or molds to press the clay into those molds for making usually the body of the teapot. They're much less expensive than fully handmade pots, which made without the use of any shape guides or molds. Be wary of cheaper pots which claim to be from Yixing and claim to be made from genuine Zisha. They may be slip cast pots, which will most likely not be made from genuine Yixing Zisha. It's very unlikely. In slip casting, clay powder is mixed with water and additives to make a suspension, which is poured into molds and allowed to set. The quality of the resulting clay cannot compare with traditionally made clay, as I've shown you all of the different processes to make really good quality clay. And Yixing stopped producing slip cast pots about 60 years ago, but there are still plenty of slip cast pots pretending to be Yixing clay teaware out there for you to purchase or avoid. Before we end this video, let me quickly dispel one very common myth which I often hear, and that is that it's impossible to get authentic Yixing Zisha clay teapots in the modern day because Yixing has run out of clay. This is simply not true. Firstly, there are huge stockpiles of clay from the original mines and from these old mines and from more modern mines available to potters. Secondly, there are still active mines mining quality ores. And lastly, the original mines were closed for environmental reasons and not because they have been depleted of ores. A 2005 survey estimated that humans have mined less than 10% of the available Yixing raw ores and clay existing in the Yixing area. These myths of impossible to source clays are perpetuated by sellers to exaggerate desirability. It's also important to say that there are clays being produced outside of the Yixing area which also have remarkable quality and produce wonderful teaware, even apart from the other main famous clays out there. Loads of other areas and there are mountains that have incredible Zisha-like ores out there. This is obviously true for the famous clay regions, but even for lesser known areas, they can produce very high quality clays. So don't restrict yourself to only looking for Yixing. Obviously, the heritage and expertise of Yixing provides confidence to a buyer that the teaware should be of excellent standards, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't explore teaware and clay from other places. Anyway, I hope that this Yixing deep dive has been useful. I've literally only scratched the surface, even though it's a deep dive on this subject. And if you want to dive in deeper, then again, I highly recommend subscribing to the teatechnique.org, which has a book which is being written from which I have learned a lot myself and has greatly helped in making this video. I can also personally vouch for all of the Yixing teaware on our website. While it is never possible to verify the exact ores, the exact mines and blends used to make any clay teapot, all of our selection has been tested thoroughly with tea in side-by-side tastings, because ultimately I want to know about the functionality, the aesthetics, and the quality of the clay in terms of how it affects my tea. So you can go check them out if you fancy treating yourself to some new teaware. That's it, tea heads. Check out other videos, taste our teas wherever you're in the world by browsing mayleaf.com, and come visit us if you're ever in London. Other than that, I'm Don from Mayleaf. Thank you for being part of the revelation of true tea. Stay away from those tea bags. Keep drinking the good stuff and spread the word, because nobody deserves bad tea. Bye.